It's good to be back with you. I always feel so young when I come here. It's great. Most of you have one of these. If you haven't filled them out, I'll tell you what to do with them in a few minutes. And I'm going to put you to work at a couple of places in the service today, so in the message. So what's the first thing in your mind as you just came up here and didn't think it was a lamb? What's it here for? What's in it? One of the guys in my church said, "Are you going to fill it up with beer?" That should tell you something about the church I serve. It's just here for a moment, just to spark some things. I know that Chad, I don't know how Chad gives me these topics. The last time he gave me the passage in the Petrine epistles about slaves, I was really appreciative of that. And in our culture, that's not a big topic. And so he's in between now, and I understand you're starting parables next week. Parables are one of my favorite subjects. I love New Testament parables, and the Old Testament is full of them as well. They're kind of hidden. I had a discussion with Julia Evans a few minutes ago about the Proverbs, about them really being kind of mini parables. Every one of those is sort of a parable. And so I want to talk to you about story tonight. Can we get those slides up somewhere? Yay. So I found this, we'll go back one. Yeah, don't leave that lovely picture there. Can you guys see that well enough? Can you identify that crazy man there? I don't have my wife with me today, so I had to bring a picture of her. This is when we first started dating about 3 years ago. And found this quote. It's really good. "A good story is always more dazzling than a broken piece of truth." I think that's sort of the heart of what I want you to think about today. And I'm going to turn to a story, a parable in the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant in just a few minutes. We're going to look at 1 Samuel 12. And it is, again, one of my favorite ones. It's got a great phrase in it that we're going to work on together. But I want to, because parables really are miniature stories. And they can be one or two lines, or they can be longer, like the prodigal son, and have a developed plot and anticipation and denouement and all that kind of stuff that goes with storytelling. But the effect of stories in the biblical text, and I want to suggest to you right now, the effect of stories in our own lives is meant to pull us towards God Almighty. And that the substance and the point of the stories of our own lives are meant to make us more conscious of who God is, as well as others around us. And so that's part of what I want you to do in just a moment here with the storytelling sheets on your laps, if you have them there. Go to that next slide. Parables are described in lots of different definitions. Usually they're meant to be a story with one focal point, or a heavenly story with an earthly meaning, or an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, depending on which critical commentary you want to read. And so I don't know what Chad's going to do with that, but parables are all over the place in the New Testament, especially the parables of Jesus. There are sowers, and there are lost sons and lost coins and lost sheep. We didn't bring the sheep tonight. We left her home. Hey, I got to tell you, when I took the lamb back last time, the mother rejected it. Yeah, it wasn't a very fun moment in my life, or the people who supplied it to me, because they had to raise it on their own. Still paying a bit of a price for that, unfortunately. Parables are about bread and stones and snakes and all kinds of other stuff. And there is something about listening to story in coming to understand who God is in our lives that I really want us to push today. And so we're going to look at this Old Covenant story that borders on parable. I want to entitle it, "How to Catch a Lying King." And that's really what the story is about. But for a moment here, take a moment, and if you haven't already done this, on that piece of paper that I gave you, just draw a picture if you want to, or write down just a few words of a story that you would, part of your life, an incident, or about a person, or about yourself, something that in a few words you can tell to somebody else in just a moment in this service, okay? So how many of you have already done that? Let me see your hands. Okay, take about two seconds to do that. I'll put my stopwatch on 30 seconds to you. Don't have to be elaborate, just something to remind you. And I'm really interested in the artwork too. If you're an artist, it's an easier way to do it if you can do pictures better than words. That's not a bad way to do it. But right now, just go ahead and do this. I can tell you're all college students. You're not back into the mode of doing homework yet. Some of you are college students. Okay, so it doesn't have to be much. It can be a funny story. It can be a sad story. It could be fulfilling. It could be creative. Whatever you want to write down there. Okay, and at the risk of losing you for the rest of the message here, I'm going to go on, knowing that you're probably still writing. Well, I want to say this to my girlfriend. If somebody writes, "Will you marry me?" and they give it to, I'm going to be thrilled. That would be a really cool thing to happen in the moment. But I don't really think, nobody warned me about that, so I don't know. So one of the things I want us to think about also in this message is the way that we tell the good news in our lives through story. How we describe what God has done, or maybe how we describe what God has not done, because that could be part of the story as well, where we have somehow missed, or we feel like God has missed us, that could be part of how we understand the story. So let me read to you. Let me not do that. Let's go to the next slide here. Go ahead. Uno mas. There we go. Okay. Every story has background. Every one of the stories that you're working on out there, madly Pulitzer Prize winning fiction or nonfiction, has background to it. And so, real quickly, sort of pop-up responses. I don't know if Chad does this to you or not, but let's test your biblical knowledge. What's the background to Nathan's confrontation of David? What's the story in the background? Bathsheba, you're so quiet. Yeah, Bathsheba is right. And what happened there? You know, we're all adults. Tell the story here. What happened? He had an affair with her. Was that all that happened? Essentially killed her husband, had her husband killed off, hit a contract on him with his good general friend. And then what happened? Yeah, she got pregnant as part of the process. So pretty normal 21st century story played out in the 10th century BC, right? It's been going on a long time, 3,000 years or beyond. And so there's some sordid details in the background of this story of shame and betrayal on the part of a king who should have been out with his troops. So there's some laziness on his part, some backing away from responsibility that he had to be with his armies. And because of that, he got in trouble. They didn't have internet pornography in those days, but you could get your eyes full by looking downstream, down the hill from the palace into where people normally bathed on their rooftops in Jerusalem, and that's just what happened. Whether or not Bathsheba was a setup in that, you have to decide. Personally, I don't believe she was. I think David did this all on his own. And so we've got all those sort of lurid details that hang around the background of this story. And then one of Nathan's best friends, one of his greatest confidants, one of his greatest advisors, comes to him and he does this to him. Chapter 12 of 2 Samuel. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him." David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity." Now, at that point, I want to stop and say, okay, David, which is it? Is he going to die or is he going to pay for the lamb? See, there's a little vacillation already on David's part. I want to suggest to you that's the hint in the storyteller's mind that David already knows the end of this story. Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man." This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel. I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all of Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword will never depart from your house because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says, out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. And if you know the rest of the story, that takes place. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, meaning your son Absalom. And he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. I want to suggest to you that's an incomplete confession. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So let me tell you a little bit about this background. Go ahead. What's that next? Go ahead. The parable of the lambs and the visitors is a classic one. Nathan doesn't introduce it. Let me tell you a story. Hey, David, did you hear what happened down the street? He just launches into the story. And if you are a storyteller, you know that that's a great way to capture the imagination and the attention of those who are listening. If someone says, let me tell you a story, if it's somebody that you know, then you might say, I don't really want to listen to another story from this guy, and you turn them off. Or if it's something you don't know, you might be intrigued, but if they just launch into the story, our imaginations are captured right off the bat, and that's what Nathan does. A certain man had a ewe lamb. A certain man, undescribed who they are. 2 men in a city, and one of them had a ewe lamb all by himself. And so he captures us in this parable right away, just by laying it out simply. Go ahead. The kingly response of justice is classic for me. And I sort of hinted at this already. I think David already saw the flow of this story by the time Nathan got to the end of the parable. That man deserves to die. Oh, wait a minute. That's really like something I did. Maybe he should just pay for it 4 times over. That's what the law said. If you go back into the Levitical code, you will find that if a man kills or steals another man's lamb or head of cattle, he has to pay 4 times over. For David knows that law. And so he's fallen back on the legalism that he thought would set him free. First, it's that guy should die. Oh, wait a minute. That might be too harsh. Let's just let him pay for it the way the law says. And so the kingly response of justice here is remarkable. We would expect a king to say something like that, right? He's the chief judge in the land. It's his responsibility to keep things in line governmentally and ethically and morally. And so he takes that strong response, and then Nathan does this. He tells the truth this way. And I'm going to let you learn a little Hebrew today. Some of you may know. Anybody know Hebrew in here besides the old guy standing in front of you? Okay, so this is your chance to learn a great phrase. How many of you watched the British Open today? The Open. Anybody? Any of you golfers? Oh, come on. Oh, there's one guy back there. Phil Mickelson run, by the way. And you know, one of the nice things about the crowd in Britain is that they don't have some crazy guy at every hole going, "You the man!" back in the things. They do say, "Go in the hole," but they don't ever say, "You the man." Well, here's the phrase in Hebrew that Nathan said to him. You can go ahead and put that up if you want. The prophetic truth-telling is this. Ata ha'ish. Ata ha'ish. You, the man, literally. Okay, so you're all going to get to say it out loud. Ata ha'ish. Easy stuff. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Ata ha'ish. Ata ha'ish. Ready? Ha'ish. Okay, ready? Loud. 1, 2, 3. That's better. Okay, now you can all go home and tell somebody you know Hebrew, all right? Or the next time you go to a golf match, you go, Ata ha'ish! You're the man. You're the man. David got it right away. So this other quote here from Emma Donahue. Stories are a different kind of true. And that is exactly the web that Nathan has caught David in. He has forced him to look at the truth without getting in his face and shaking his finger like this. Every one of us who's grown up as a child knows what happens when your mother does this to you. All right? You're in trouble, and immediately we begin to develop our defenses and to blame it on our brother or our sister, whoever else is there. But the storytelling where it draws us into the truth won't let us escape because we're already enmeshed in it before we can protest. And that's exactly what happened to David. David's confession at this point is really fascinating to me. You heard the piety of it. I have sinned against the Lord. But he didn't mention Bathsheba, nor his other wives, nor Uriah, nor the people of Israel. It's just God. Now, I understand the leveling of that. But when I hear Jesus talk about how we show our deepest faith, it is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and body, and your neighbor as yourself. And that's the way we sin, too. We don't just sin against the Father. The responsibility is David's also to confess, I have sinned against Bathsheba and Uriah and the people of Israel that have trusted me. Go ahead to that next slide. David's partial confession here. Have you seen this picture before? Let me tell you the story behind this. This is 1975, August 1st, Edmonton, Kentucky. Anybody ever been to Edmonton, Kentucky in here? Edmonton, you know Edmonton, really? About 15 minutes from Glasgow, 45 minutes from Bowling Green, South Central Kentucky. 1,500 people in the town. County seat, 10,000 people in the county, rural. I mean, really rural. Now, 1975, this guy showed up with that massive bush as their pastor. And we went down to, after we moved in that day, it was the first part of August, it was 100 degrees. I was sweating. We had run out of gas. We were dirty. We had unpacked about half of the moving van. And I said, let's take a break, go down and get the mail. I'd already gotten the mailbox. We didn't have mailboxes by the house. You had to go down to the post office to get it. And it was sort of the central gathering place for everybody around the town square with the courthouse in the middle. And as we did, I said, let's go in and subscribe to the newspaper. Bi-weekly, came out Tuesdays and Fridays. And it was filled with little stories like, Millers have bedtime guests. Anybody have a guess about what that means? Somebody came late after dinner to our house, and it ended up in the newspaper. Like that was really good news, that everybody ought to know about. And so the first time my wife walked into the IGA grocery store, the second day we were there, some lady walked up to her out of the blue and said, "Oh, you're the pastor's wife." And she went, "Whoa, this is not Louisville anymore. This is not a big city." And so when we walked into the newspaper office, the lady behind the desk said, "Oh yeah, I'd like to take your subscription. And oh, by the way, your news. So let's take you out in the street and take your picture and put it on the front page of Tuesday's edition." Luckily, I got to preach my first sermon before they saw this picture. I want you to tell your own story for just a moment here. And I'm going to put you on the clock, okay? We're going to do 1 minute in each direction, okay? So I've got my Jim Dandy running clock here. Half of you raise your hands. This ought to be interesting. Half of you sitting, okay. Find somebody to tell what's written on your text, okay? You have 1 minute, go now. Tell something about your story right now. Turn to each other. Okay, stop. Stop. Okay? All right, I'm interested in one or two really fascinating stories. Somebody hear a story that they thought was just knock your socks off, either funny, incredible. Stand up real quickly and tell us. Real quickly. Come on, be brave. Anybody? No interesting stories in this crowd? I don't believe that. Okay, would you? Yeah, please. Okay, speak loudly. Okay.
One time me and Nate, we were in China, and these guys came and said, do you like video games? And we said, yes. And they said, follow us. And we went upstairs, and there was a room, and we shot real machine guns at human-shaped targets.
That's a good story. I like that. Okay. So then, did you tell them the story of Jesus after that?
No.
Oh, okay. Somebody else. One more. A female. Some female here, a good story? Yeah. Oh, come on, girls. I know you heard some good stories. The funny thing was, I was watching and the girls are all talking back and forth to each other. Interplay. And the guys are going. One person, anybody. Don't be shy about a good story you heard. Okay.
When I was a kid, my brother tied me to the lamppost and told me a scorpion from the Bible. At the last minute,
Okay, all right. So, was it hard to tell your story in just a few minutes, in a minute? Yes, no? Sort of? How many of you talked about God in your story? Anybody? Be honest. I'm not looking for piety here. I'm just curious. Okay, cool. Okay, go to the next slide, will you? I'm going to give you some things to think about for story here. And I want to see if you can spin a story out of the next three things that appear on the slide. And we're going to come back to the Bible, I promise you, okay? Go ahead. First thing, the Maytag man. Buying a washing machine in Albany, Georgia from Bill Blanton and his wife, Myrtle Lee. Bill Blanton was the Maytag man. I couldn't get a Maytag washer in here, so I brought the empty, just to make sure you don't trust me here, the empty college roommate's refrigerator. So that's the first part of the story. Next. Little boy and a dad, okay, with a jet in his hands. And next. An older, very elegant woman, okay? What kind of story could you spin very quickly out of that? Just do popcorn here. Anybody? Okay, that could be one of the storylines. Okay. Anything else? What comes to mind out of those three things? They are connected, I can tell you. The what? Could be a mom thinking about your son or something like that. Okay. Anything else? It could be Myrtle Lee. That was actually the name, Myrtle Lee Blanton. It's a good South Georgia name. Anybody from Albany, Georgia here? No. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, well, let me fill in the blanks here. Did you want? Yeah, I saw hands waving there. So.
Say that he, the gentleman with the son, had an eye for cougars. He married her. They had the son, and he had an interest in electronic games. So on a trip to Albany, Georgia, he was in a washing machine store, saw a washing machine. He gave me time.
There's a story writer right there. The cougar line is a little off the edge, but that's okay. Okay, go ahead, next slide. Let me tell you the story. Go ahead. First thing is, a decorated F-84 pilot comes back from Korea. That was the guy with the airplane in his hand. He had been written up in Life magazine in 1951, I think November issue. He and two of his pilots in the same unit were involved in a rescue at 30,000 feet over Korea. The lead pilot's oxygen went out, and this pilot came up with the crazy idea of putting their wingtips underneath the tanks of the lead pilot, and they actually guided him down to below 10,000 feet where he came back to consciousness just about the time they were trying to figure out how to land him. Actual story. You can go look that up in Life magazine if you want. Next. He happened to be stationed after that episode in Albany, Georgia, where his wife and small child and another child on the way needed a washing machine. So he went to a Maytag salesman whose name was Bill Blanton, and go ahead, who was an Old South Presbyterian who just happened to be a follower of Jesus. This guy, the pilot, was a heathen, pagan, absolutely no faith in his life. Had never been in church. His mother was Jewish. His father was an old plasterer, had no faith whatsoever. He grew up literally as a heathen, even though he was a decorated pilot in both World War II and Korea. Silver Star in World War II as he chased Patton's tanks in P-47s across Germany. The Old South Presbyterian led him to faith, Bill Blanton, and taught him how to eat fish for hush puppies and how to cook them well. And go ahead to the next part. And that little boy grew up in awe of this hero father of his. Next slide. What happened next is, go ahead. The little boy found faith in Florida, where the pilot, after leaving the Air Force, had gone to live after becoming a salesman for United States Gypsum. And he was a very successful salesman, continued to walk in his faith and stuff, and he raised his whole family, 4 boys and a girl, in faith. Okay, next. Next line of the story is that that little boy grew up, went to college during the late 60s, and learned about alcohol and marijuana and everything else that goes with it. Almost lost his life there, and as that part of the process, rebelled against his father and his mother. At one point, that young man went home, and his father, the Air Force pilot, said, "Don't come home again, you're not my son. As long as you act like that, you're not my son anymore. Don't come home." Next. Go ahead. At that point in his life, having really been literally lost, his nickname in college was Apathy, because his favorite phrase was, "Hey, you want to go to the restaurant to get something to eat? I don't care. You want to go play basketball? I don't care. You want to go over to Salem College and find a cute lady to date? I don't care." Apathy became his nickname. On one of those trips to Salem College across town, he happened to meet a young Southern belle who he fell madly in love with. And suddenly, there was somebody in his life, something in his life, that he did care about. And he grew to fall in love with her, and 6 weeks after meeting her, asked her to marry him, and was shocked when she said yes. As part of the process of meeting her family, his motorcycle was broken down, and so he hitchhiked 200 miles, intending only to stay overnight. So he was dressed in bell-bottom blue jeans and a t-shirt, and had everything for overnight in a shaving kit. This big, shaving kit overnight. Ended up spending 4 days there, had to borrow underwear and clothes from the Southern belle's brother, and was introduced to the gentle grandmother who happened to be an Old South Episcopalian. Go ahead. Next slide. The end of the story is still unfolding, but that little guy who rebelled against his parents is this guy up here. All connected by storyline of a Maytag salesman who had enough sense to say to a customer, "Have you ever met Jesus?" And so 3 generations now from that Maytag salesman, my family lives under the grace and the mercy of God Almighty, who has overlooked all that stupidity that I was living in when I was in college. That's not all the story. I'm going to need some help to do some more here, but let's go on to the next thing here. I want to give you a couple principles as you think about your own stories, okay? Because at some point, somebody in your life, in one of your small groups, one of your home groups, and I kind of investigated the pictures and where you meet and what you do back on the back thing back there, somebody's going to say, "Hey, tell me about your story." Now, it might be a simple thing about being tied to a lamppost by your brother. It might be something else that opens the way for you to say, "Let me tell you about who Jesus is in my life." Or it might be they'll say, "Tell me about who Jesus is," and you go, "I don't have that story." And in that moment, you're going to have to discover maybe from that other person or the people around you, what the story of Jesus is all about as it touches us. And so here's a couple of principles for you. I have yet to see a frontal assault that really worked when it comes to either confronting people about brokenness or even sometimes about telling them about Jesus. I think it's why I use stuff like lambs and refrigerators in messages. Because there is something about opening the story with a little bit of a curveball that helps you think about where in the world are we headed here? What is this all about? The second thing is this. The Nathan story, I am convinced, really did touch everything that was just and righteous about David. Now, his sinful heart had covered most of that up. That's the effect of sin in our lives all the time. The greatest disguiser of our hearts is our own sin. Because it's really ugly to let other people look at it. And so we cover it up and we make it look good. And so David right away says, that man deserves to die. At least he has to pay back that lamb 4 times over. The reality was David did deserve to die for what he had done. He was a murderer and an adulterer and a liar. And he deserved to die. The truth of that story really did bring significant change to David's life. If you know the rest of the story, you know that the tragedy of that moment was that son lost his life. Bathsheba's son died. Nathan said, you won't die, but your son will. The other part of the effect of David's sin was that his family was a wreck for the rest of his life. Absalom and Tamar, horrible stories in the life of David. It didn't correct all of that. If you know Psalm 51, which is David's prayer and song after this confession, have mercy on me, O Lord, have mercy. Wash me with hyssop and I will be whiter than snow. A couple verses into that psalm, there's a haunting phrase. David says, my sin is always before me. And I'm convinced with everything that I am as a man that every time he saw Bathsheba walk down the hallway, he experienced that sin again. In spite of the forgiveness, in spite of him being washed clean by God, he experienced that moment when he had broken covenant with God and himself and the people of Israel. So what happens when you tell the story? Does it encompass all of that? Does it come to the place where you understand that the steadfast mercy of the Lord endures forever? Is that the end of the story for you? I need 3 real quick volunteers, and then I'm going to close. So 3 men. Let's jump up here. Come on. Nothing bad will happen to you, okay? I'll tell you a little bit. You can stand right here in front. If you want to, yeah, just stand there. So you guys have to remember the names. Okay, Bill Scott, Lloyd Pugh, and Jim Richards. Okay? I'm not much of a Calvinist. I'm sort of like 4 points Calvinist or 3.5 or something like that. Depending on how Sunday went on Monday morning, I might be 4.5 points. Lord, take those people, you know they're not really saved. But I've understood after a long time in ministry the complexity and the tension between the freedom of human beings and the sovereignty of God. And I always am amazed, should not be, but I'm always amazed at the creative sovereignty of God to get us where he wants us to be. 1981, I came to Tucson, Arizona. My dad was pastor at Green Valley Baptist Church, started Green Valley Baptist Church. He was the founding pastor. And he was having serious heart attack and has heart surgery, had a major heart attack on the table at UMC while I was here, so I had to stay a little extra time. And Jim Richards at that point was the director of missions for Catalina Baptist Association. He said, "Hey Dane, I'd like to take you up into the foothills and show you a new church plant that we're already in process with. First Southern Baptist Church began it a few months ago. They really want to turn it over to Green Valley Baptist Church. I've already talked to your dad about this. If you're willing to leave Edmonton, Kentucky, where I'd been for 3 years, and come and be the pastor." Now, I had told the people in Edmonton, Kentucky that I would be there at least 5 years because they had gone through a real struggle, and I really felt like I needed to stabilize things before I even thought about going. After 2.5 years, I thought I'd learned everything there was to know about being a pastor in this little town. I was bored to death, literally. And I thought to myself, if I drink one more cup of coffee with Donnie Butler at the Metcalf drugstore, I'm going to go crazy. And so when Jim Richards said, "Hey, there's a really cool place in the foothills, Sunrise Drive of Tucson," everything in my pride quotient skyrocketed. And I said, "Well, sure, I'll think about that, but I need some time to pray about it." So 4 months later, I told my dad, "Okay, we're willing to come." Now, in that meantime, I had gone out in the little graveyard behind our church in Edmonton, Kentucky, down the valley and up on the graveyard where the founder of Edmonton, Edmund Rogers, was buried. And I had prayed for 4 months, "Lord, I don't know what to do here. Tell me what to do." And every single time I prayed that prayer, inescapably the answer was, "Don't you dare leave Edmonton, Kentucky." And I would go home and I would tell my wife, "I think it's time for us to go to Tucson." 4 months of that, and every time she would say, "I don't think that's what we're supposed to do." And then finally she caved in. She said, "Look, if you think we need to go to Tucson, we'll go to Tucson." So we called Jim Richards and told him that I should come. 2.5 years later, after killing ourselves at Sunrise Mission, we were told there were 35 people there, all from the foothills. And you can sit down, Jim, if you want. You guys can sit. Yeah, sit right here. You're going to be back in the story. Sit down a minute. 2.5 years later, after killing ourselves at Sunrise Mission, we had been told there were 35 people who wanted a church, all from the foothills. The first Sunday we got there, there were 7 people there, all from Drexel Heights. Do you know Drexel Heights? The difference between Drexel Heights and Sunrise? Like economically massive, another cosmos. And they had been dragged in there by the founding pastor who was ready to walk away from it. And so that was a lot of tears on the way home as we went back to Green Valley to my parents. Edmonton Church actually asked us to come back. Too much pride in me said, "I can't do that. We've committed to be here." And so 2.5 years later, we built up to 35 people, and then IBM closed their plant, and our 3 primary families moved out of town. And we were ready to start over again or quit. I was absolutely, utterly crushed. I'd never failed at anything in my life, ever, never. And so I decided at that point that I would go back to the University of Arizona, do a PhD in Old Testament. And about that time, I rode out to 3 Points on my motorcycle to help my brother dig his own septic tank by hand. That's how stupid I was. And as I rode by this little church in 3 Points, little 30 by 40 frame building, I uttered through the windscreen of my motorcycle helmet, "Please, Lord, don't call me to that place. Any place on your earth, don't call me to that place." 2 weeks later, the phone rang, and it was the chairman of the pulpit committee who said, "Your name has been given to us by our interim pastor as a possible candidate for our pulpit." At which point I broke into hysterical laughter and hung up. Let's see, you're who?
Bill Scott.
Lloyd Pugh, stand up. Stand up. Lloyd Pugh was the interim pastor. He had been in Tucson for ages. And I'd never met the man, had no idea who he was, but he said, "Hey, there's a young man, I think he'll be a great pastoral candidate for you, especially since nobody else will come out here." Which was true. And that's the word that the pulpit committee said to me, "Nobody else will come out here. So will you come here for $50 a week?" At which point I said, "Sure, if you want to call me, I can do that. Sit down," okay? And so then what happened was I interviewed with the pulpit committee. They said, "We'll contact you." and I got a call from the pulpit committee chairwoman again, and she said, well, and this is her exact words, we decided we needed to listen to you anyway. I didn't know whether that meant they didn't like me, but they needed somebody to fill the pulpit Sunday, or this was a call sermon. They had already made up their mind, but they had to go through the formalities. So I went and preached, and as I stepped out of the pulpit, the chairman of the deacons-to-be said, okay, if you'll step outside, we'll vote on you. And 17-2 votes later, we were called as pastor at Edmonton, Kentucky. 2 years later, full stream into my PhD, I'm going crazy because, number one, PhD study is absolutely stupid anyway. The most insane thing you can ever do. Don't ever do a PhD if somebody invites you to do it. And because you'll have to go through your defense and then you lose your mind totally. And so I'm a golfer, and if you didn't figure that out yet, and I needed to go play golf, and I stood up in the congregation and I said, is there anybody who will go play golf with me? Nobody in the church played golf. Now that morning, a very dapper gentleman by the name of Bill Scott had walked in his 70s, bearded, tall, about 6'3", I don't know, are you 6'3"? Not quite, 6'3", and he was in a three-piece suit, obviously a Baptist, and from Alabama to boot. And he walked up after the service and he said to me, hi, my name's Bill Scott. I'm your golfing partner. When are we going to play? Had no idea who this was, but I had asked for a golfing partner. I got a golfing partner. And so Bill Scott and I got up early in the morning for the next year or so, and we went and we stopped at McDonald's and got a biscuit and sausage on our way to Santa Rita Golf Course. And we played golf, and then we would stop at Popeye's Fried Chicken across from VA on the way home because that was his favorite. And so we got to be best friends, literally. He was one of the guys in my life who I needed desperately. Wisdom and a gentle guy and make you laugh like nobody you could ever talk to. And so I said, hey, Bill, I knew he had moved from Alabama to Tucson in 1940. As he said, my first child was conceived under the Welcome to Arizona sign as you crossed in from New Mexico. In the back seat of their 37 Ford or whatever he was driving. And he said, well, I used to go to Columbia Street Baptist Church, right down the street. And I knew where Columbia Street Baptist Church was. And I said, well, who was the pastor when you were there in the 1940s? And he said, Lloyd Pugh. And I said, oh, really? I happen to know somebody else who was at Columbia Street during that time. He was a guy who was sort of instrumental in bringing me to Tucson. His name was Jim Richards. At which point, Bill Scott got as white as a ghost. He said, I led Jim Richards to the Lord in my living room because we used to have guys from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base come over to our house on Sunday afternoon in the early 50s and feed them fried chicken, and they came because I had two gorgeous teenage daughters. And Jim Richards gave his life to the Lord in my rocking chair. And Lloyd Pugh was his pastor. Both these guys got me to 3 Points, where I met Bill Scott. You couldn't make that up if you had to. I believe deeply in the sovereignty of God in helping us tell our stories as He intertwines men and women's lives, as He helps us tell the message of faith to others. I was supposed to be in 3 Points for 2 years. This coming Sunday will end 29 years there in 3 Points. And I can tell you that I would not be who I am without those almost 30 years in ministry in a place where I had said to God, don't call me to that place. God always knows better. And He always has some fun linking our stories together. Will you pray with me? Thanks, guys. Can you go to that next slide? This is the way I'd like us to pray as you think about your own life. Perhaps it is how we are made. Perhaps words of truth reach us best through the heart, and stories and songs are the language of the heart. I think that's what the Scripture does to us. As we see ourselves enmeshed in the story of Jesus, the cosmos brought together by God Almighty and displayed among us, never, ever doubt your story in the hands of God. It's there for a reason. Be willing to tell it to others. Where Jesus has touched you through the lives of Bill Scott and Lloyd Pugh and Jim Richards and little old Episcopalian grandmas and Maytag salesmen.